Thanks for coming out to hear about the problems with Common Core. And I apologize in advance for my voice. I'm getting over a cold, so if I sound horrible, I apologize. So I just want to kick it off, and then we're going to hear from a few experts that have been studying this since its inception in 2009, to hopefully give you everything you would want to know about the myriad problems with Common Core. So I'm Lindsey Burke. I'm with the Heritage Foundation. I oversee our education policy work at Heritage. We focus on primarily K-12 work. We dabble a little bit in higher ed. We do some preschool work as well. Our two primary goals are to limit federal intervention in education and to expand school choice and to promote its proliferation across the country. Common Core, we see, is falling under that former piece, the limiting federal intervention, and we certainly see this as federal overreach. And that is our primary concern with Common Core, is that it further entrenches the federal government into what is taught in the nation's schools across the country. We have seen creeping, some people would say galloping, federal overreach into education for the past half century now. And from my perspective, that type of intervention really is a zero-sum game. Every inch the federal government takes comes at the expense of state and local control in education. And I think that something as important as what is taught in local schools throughout the country should not be subjected to centralization or the whims of Washington bureaucrats. What is taught in America's classrooms should be informed by parents, by principals, by teachers, by the business community, all of those entities coming together to provide input about the skills that are necessary and needed for students to be competitive when they leave high school. One size does not fit all when it comes to standards and assessments. Regional economies, state priorities, the needs of individual school districts should dictate standards and assessments that drive curricula for a given school system, not national organizations or Washington bureaucrats who, honestly, when you think about why they're interested in nationalizing standards, excuse me, it's really more about the ease of uniformity for bureaucrats, for the bean counters in Washington. But I can guarantee you that not only are states risking their education decision-making authority by adopting Common Core national standards, they're signing on to a standardization push that will ultimately fail wildly to improve educational outcomes. And once these Common Core national standards are fully implemented, if we make a mistake, if these centralizers that are pushing these standards make a mistake, it will be nearly impossible to fix those mistakes down the road once they're codified at the federal level. So now is the time, in our perspectives, to put the brakes on this Common Core train wreck. So what is the nature of federal involvement exactly in Common Core? You're probably all aware of federal involvement with Common Core, but just so we're all working off the same page, here's how the Obama administration has pushed states to adopt Common Core over the past 3 years. In the first real instance, so we saw the National Governors Association, the Council of Chief State Schools Officers, crafting the standards. These are English language arts standards and mathematics standards. That started back in 2009. Ostensibly a voluntary movement by these two organizations. That's how it was billed, but it was voluntary for a nanosecond. From the beginning, the administration was heavily involved, offering carrots and a sort of carrot and stick approach to get states to adopt. We saw $4.35 billion in federal race to the top money dangled before cash-strapped states to incentivize them to adopt Common Core national standards. Now, the language in Race to the Top says that in order for a state to be competitive in the grant competition, now that $4 billion was carved out of the so-called stimulus, if you remember 3 years ago, was about $787 billion. The Department of Ed got a $100 billion grant directly out of the stimulus. Race to the Top grant was carved out of that. In order for states to get a slice of that money, they had to agree to adopt standards that were common to a significant number of states. Well, the only standards game in town that met that criteria and still meet that criteria is the Common Core national standards push. So $4.35 billion at a time when states were pretty cash-strapped was a major incentive for them to adopt. But in addition to those Race to the Top grants, There was $360 million appropriated to directly finance from the federal level the 2 national testing consortia. Again, money carved out of the stimulus. So you've got direct federal financing of the assessments that are aligned with the standards. You have Race to the Top grants. And now you have the Obama administration tying No Child Left Behind waivers to whether or not a state effectively has adopted national standards and tests. I think nearly anyone who works in a school, in a state department of education, or who you just stop on the street and ask would say No Child Left Behind does not work. It's been failing children. It was a major federal overreach. Nobody's asking for more No Child Left Behind. But this idea that the administration would offer strings-attached waivers to states, conditioned in part on whether or not, again, the language was they had adopted standards that were common to a significant number of states, we think was yet another major federal incentive. So now you've got Race to the Top, direct federal financing of the assessments, and No Child Left Behind waivers. So the most recent instance of federal overreach into the standard setting process was a panel, a review panel that the Department of Education just announced. It's a technical review panel to oversee item design and validation on the Common Core testing consortia, raising questions about the degree to which the agency is actually dictating what is on these tests, what's on these Common Core assessments. So I tell you all of that background to say, for an effort that is ostensibly voluntary, and what the Common Core proponents will tell you all day long is voluntary effort, there are quite a few federal fingerprints. So this is why I say it was a nanosecond. If it were ever voluntary, for a nanosecond, until the administration became involved with the effort. From the beginning, we've seen them heavily involved rhetorically, financially, which is why we see it, why Heritage sees this as a national standards push, not some sort of benign Common Core. But regardless of all of those federal fingerprints, even if you just see this as 2 national organizations, National Governors Association, Council of Chief State Schools Officers, even if you just see it that way, pushing the standards, this is an effort to impose a uniform, standardized curriculum across the country. And from my perspective, uniformity has very little merit. Centralization has little merit. In fact, those ends are antithetical to what we know works in education, which is choice and competition. And that goes for standards and tests as well. What we should be doing is pushing for robust and expansive school choice options for all families, allowing families to choose schools that use varying curricula that meet their child's unique learning needs. The efficacy of choice is what led in part to the Republican National Committee just 2 weeks ago now releasing a statement condemning Common Core, in which they said that Common Core effectively removes educational choice and competition. That's the RNC saying this. The RNC, it says, recognizing CCSS for what it is, an inappropriate overreach to standardize and control the education of our children. That was a couple of weeks ago, as I said. About a week ago, we saw Iowa Senator Chuck Grassley send a letter around addressing his concerns with Common Core. He sent this to the Senate Appropriations Committee, and he was worried about Common Core overreach. And he sent this to the Appropriations Committee to eliminate further interference by the U.S. Department of Education with respect to state decisions on academic content standards. That's how he stated it in his letter. So we're seeing momentum, a little bit of pushback against Common Core. 46 states have adopted so far, 45 in DC, which sounds like a lot of momentum. But I think we are now at the point where we are seeing parents, taxpayers, teachers, school board leaders, state leaders, federal leaders wake up and see this for what it is, as a massive push to centralize and nationalize the content taught in every public school and potentially private school across the country. We're seeing momentum in Indiana and Alabama, Michigan, states across the country. Momentum really for these states to reclaim their educational decision-making authority and hop off this national standards bandwagon. So I'll just leave you with 2 things. Remember, what the federal government funds, it ultimately controls. And that is our biggest concern with this Common Core national standards push. The last thing I'll leave you with is a quote I just read by Congressman Trent Franks from Arizona. And I think this really sort of puts it in perspective. He said, put simply, there are really only two options when it comes to who will determine the substance of a child's education. Two options. It will either be a bureaucrat who doesn't know the child's name, or a parent who would pour out their last drop of blood for a child. Nothing is more important to America's future than making sure that the education of the hearts and minds of our children is securely in the purview of the parents who love and understand them most. Now I'm going to turn over to Jim Stergios to talk a little bit more about his concerns.
Thanks very much for being here this morning. Jim Stergios, Pioneer Institute. We're a state-based think tank in Boston. We work nationally in education, primarily in the area of charter schools and also the question of standards, what gets taught in the classroom, and health care. I'm going to talk to you about content. And just before talking to you about, please.
I'm sorry, I just want to inform you. I'm officially hard of hearing.
Okay.
I just changed my battery. So that
Well, I'm going to talk right at you and make sure you hear every word.
So please, if you could just speak up a little.
Absolutely,
Thank
absolutely. You. Okay. Before getting into content, I just want to put one punctuation on what Lindsey just said about federal encroachment. And that is, we did a report on the legal dimensions of Common Core, a report that was written by the former General Counsel and the Deputy General Counsel of the United States Department of Education. And what they said is that Common Core is violating 3 federal laws. These are not fly-by-night lawyers, folks. These are high-paid experts, the top legal professionals within the Department of Education. Okay? I would also state to our friends, there are friends among us who think that Common Core is it's not federal overreach. Think that LBJ and Jimmy Carter signed 2 of those laws restricting the federal government from a hand in developing standards and tests and curriculum materials. That was seen as a bridge too far by LBJ and Jimmy Carter, and we're here today supposed to accept that this is a conservative education approach. I don't buy it for a second, not after seeing unilateral waivers used by Arne Duncan, federally appointed review panel that Lindsey was talking about. Look, maybe the best way to further punctuate is just to quote James Madison from the cod fisheries debates, where he says, if Congress can apply money indefinitely to the general welfare, they may establish teachers in every state, county, and parish, and pay them out of the public treasury. They may take into their own hands the education of children, establishing in like manner schools throughout the Union. That would subvert the very foundation and transmute the very nature of the limited government established by the people of America. I think case closed on that. What animates Pioneer in this debate primarily is not just federal encroachment, though. It is content. Massachusetts history is that we were a slightly above average performer in 1990. We developed a whole set of state-based approaches, including choice, accountability, and high-quality academic liberal arts-focused standards. And we've gone from about 13th in the country to number 1 in the country on the national assessments, and we're in the top 6 countries in math and science. We were not there in 1990. States can do a lot. We don't need the feds involved in this. And I'd like to talk to you a little bit about Common Core's content specifically. We have done more independent academic research on Common Core than anyone else in the country. We've accepted no funding from any foundations, testing companies, or anybody who has a dog in the hunt. Not to say that if you take money from someone who has an interest, you become somehow immediately corrupted. But there should be a certain level of skepticism applied to those who actually receive funds from, say, the Gates Foundation, which is an advocate of the Common Core, but they receive funds to actually do evaluations. Not to say those evaluations are not worth anything, but a certain amount of skepticism is absolutely necessary. Again, Jamie Madison, a personal favorite. Federalist 10 says, no man is allowed to be a judge in his own case because his interest would certainly bias his judgment and not improbably corrupt his integrity. On the quality of the Common Core, they are mediocre and they aim at community college readiness. They suffer on the English language arts side from many technical shortcomings and a lack of coherent grade-by-grade progression. When you develop standards, you need to make sure that kids are learning certain building blocks that they build upon throughout the years and over time accumulate the knowledge necessary not only for the workforce but also to be great American citizens. Sandy Stotsky, who's one of the best-known academic standards experts in the country, has said, Common Core's standards for English language arts are neither research-based nor internationally benchmarked. Common Core's ELA standards fall far below what other English-speaking nations or regions require of college-intending high school graduates. That's why she and 4 other people who are on the validation committee for Common Core stepped off and refused to sign off on them. She further questions, and you've probably read about this in the news widely, the emphasis on nonfiction, on literary nonfiction within Common Core is problematic. There is absolutely no evidence that this is something that will lead to greater college readiness. And in fact, Massachusetts took a completely different approach, and we are among the fastest improving states in the country, starting from 13th, going to number 1, and staying there. The fact is, English teachers are not trained to teach Federal Reserve Bank manuals. They're not trained to teach software development manuals for Microsoft. That's not what they're built to do. Now, I know there's a counter to that charge, and it usually comes from Gene Wilhoit, who's the head of the Council of Chief State School Officers previously. He's visited states around the country, and he said, well, you know, guys, you have lots of flexibility. If you want to put in literary content, you certainly can do that. The feds are only saying 85% has to be verbatim. You've got a 15% add-on. There is a problem with that, besides the laugh, which is a good thing. Yeah. It's that the tests are what is going to drive what people teach in the classroom. And the tests are federal tests. And the tests will not take in consideration piddling little Massachusetts, 6 million people out of 3 million people, or 300 million people. They will not consider what Massachusetts add-ons are, or what Indiana's are, or what Utah's are. So the fact is, yes, they're lessening the amount of literary content in the classroom. It's absolutely obvious. On the math side, it's no better. There again, the Common Core suffers from a lack of coherent grade-by-grade progressions. There are, however, much deeper problems. Algebra 1, Geometry, and Algebra 2 are not demanding and reflect a less than rigorous definition of college readiness. The Core's goal of teaching Algebra 1 only in high school makes it at least 1 year behind recommendations of previous national math panels. Massachusetts has it in 8th grade. California has risen from about 25% of the kids taking Algebra 1 in 8th grade to now over 60%. States can do this. It also alarmingly replaces traditional Euclidean foundations of geometry with an experimental approach to middle and high school geometry that has never been widely or ever been successfully used in those grade spans. Jim Milgram is an academic mathematician from Stanford. He is considered, if you will, the gold standard. He was on the committee evaluating Common Core. He also did not sign off on Common Core. States around the country have always sought his expertise. Places like Fordham Institute have always gone to him previously, not now anymore, for his views on math. And he says that the material covered in the Core's math standards by 5th grade are more than a year behind early grade expectations in most high-achieving countries. And by the 7th grade, they are roughly 2 years behind. He says the national math standards are written to reflect very low expectations. Jason Zimba, a physics expert, was a lead writer on math for the Common Core. He, in a Massachusetts Board of Education meeting, it's taped, we have it, admitted as much. And he said that a core-based college readiness test in math will mean that students are qualified to enroll in a non-selective community or state college. I ask you one simple question. Is this really what we're aiming for our kids? Is community college readiness so attractive that we are willing to give up on our system of competitive federalism and, in fact, the rule of law? Ted is next.
Yep. Either way.
Sorry.
My name is Ted Rebarber. It's good to be here and talk to you about Common Core, because I think, and as Lindsey and others have said, that this initiative, this federal initiative of the Obama administration, fundamentally, despite the patina of state-led that they like to put on it, has really flown under the radar screen for a lot of people. Conservatives and folks who believe in state and local autonomy and control have been so busy fighting, the nationalization of health care, the waste of the stimulus bill, so many other things. And there were so many things to fight that Common Core really flew under the radar. And that's changing, as was pointed out. And that's really recent. It's in the last year, maybe in the last 8 or 10 months, that you're seeing moms, actually, we have 2 here, and others at the local level, finding out that Common Core is supposed to be implemented next year, 2013, 2014, in their schools. Now, some of the schools have already started to implement this ahead of schedule. The eager beavers. So some are already working on this, and we can see what's coming. But people are waking up, and one of the biggest problems that we face, and I'm going to focus on actually cost of implementing Common Core and the threat to school choice. But I just want to say one thing. One of the biggest problems we face is that the business community, the Chamber of Commerce, the national level, the Business Roundtable, these groups have been sold a bill of goods about Common Core. They've been sold on the notion, the false notion, that it will raise the international competitiveness of our workforce. And there is an issue with workforce skills and competence, but Common Core is not the solution. As Jim was pointing out, some of the academic experts that have been critical of it, these individuals were actually selected by the Common Core development folks because even they respected them. So Jim Milgram was on a content validation committee, a review committee, a mathematician, on Common Core. So even their only content expert in math that was on this validation committee, on the review committee, refused to sign off. So one of the biggest tasks is to help the business community understand this is not what they were told it is. So I'm going to talk a little about cost because as Lindsey mentioned, when you had a recession and a lot of public schools were economically strapped, the dangle, federal carrot of funding in that circumstances sounded pretty appealing to a lot of people. And there were a lot of promises of flexibility, and actually a lot of folks in the schools believe there would be a lot more money coming. And so if anything, this would be a big bonanza of cash for local schools. And they're realizing that's not the case. We did a cost analysis working with Pioneer. Our organization is called AccountabilityWorks. We have an office in Maryland, and I live in Virginia. And we did a national cost study and found that the total cost of just aligning to Common Core for the states and localities that have signed up, not actually meeting all the standards, but just pointing in that direction among the public schools, is nearly $16 billion. And so those are significant costs that are going to have to be borne, and some of those may require additional expenditures. A number of states are finding that in certain areas they're going to have to significantly increase expenditures to do this, and others will require them to redirect funds that are being spent on something else. And some of the proponents of Common Core say, well, if they can just redirect some of their money, well, what's the big deal? Well, some of that money was doing worthwhile educational, was involved in worthwhile educational initiatives. So there's a cost, and there's a cost-benefit analysis that needs to be done. But some of these are actually going to be additional costs. So for example, in this $16 billion, we have technology costs of nearly $7 billion. Technology infrastructure, additional computers are going to be needed for the online tests, that the national tests are going to be online. And so this is a very real cost. And one of the other studies, in addition to ours, that's been widely cited by the Fordham Foundation, Fordham Institute, headed by Chester Finn, which is a strong proponent of national curriculum, national testing, completely left out technology costs, completely. And they had to admit this, actually, in testimony in Indiana, where we testified as well, when they were asked directly. And they said, well, schools are adding technology for all kinds of reasons, and we just decided not to include it. So it's worth noting that here in Florida, where the new superintendent, Tony Bennett, who was the former superintendent in Indiana, has been such a strong proponent of Common Core, the additional costs of technology required by Common Core has resulted in him saying publicly that they may have to delay implementation here in Florida beyond when it was scheduled because of the technology costs, particularly to school districts. And so these are very real costs that districts are going to have to face. And given the academic and other issues that were pointed out, we really have been encouraging states and localities to take another look at it. So technology costs. One other area I want to highlight is testing costs. A number of states, particularly larger states like Florida, will see a very substantial increase in their state expenditures on testing. Florida spends significantly less per student than either of the two national testing consortia cited in their grant applications to the Federal Department of Ed that were approved to get that $360 million. So a number of states, particularly the larger states, are going to have their testing costs increase. That's not money that's going to the classroom. That's going to go to just fulfill the same testing requirements that they do now more efficiently with their state tests. So there's some very real costs. Beyond that, I want to touch on school choice. A lot of us are strong believers in school choice and other market-based reforms to schools, including private and religious schools. And what Common Core is threatening is to magnify a trend that we're seeing that's just started to bubble up in some of the state voucher and choice programs that have already been implemented. In several states, like Indiana, they require private schools that accept a voucher for a private school choice program to administer the state curriculum-based test in the private school as a condition. That's a string they're tying to those funds. And that's a problem because these are not curriculum-neutral tests. These are not like the traditional norm reference tests, which tried to be as curriculum-neutral as they could be with mixed success. But these tests are designed to drive curriculum and instruction. And now with Common Core, these states adopting these national tests, Tony Bennett announced back in Indiana that they expected to require private schools to implement the national test tied to Common Core. You've got other states like Louisiana and Ohio that have also tied their state testing programs. You have other states that have not. So this is not a necessary component of private school choice. In fact, it's a threat to real choice, right? What kind of choice is it if everywhere you can choose is teaching the same curriculum or pretty close to the same curriculum? And this is a very real threat that I think all choice supporters need to be cognizant of. In other countries that have private school choice, in just about all the other countries, over several decades that they've done this, private schools have completely lost their autonomy on curriculum and other critical instructional matters. So this public funding has led to a loss of private school autonomy in just about every other country where it's occurred. Now, I do not think that has to happen here. We have the current administration has poo-pooed the American exceptionalism, but one of the very concrete ways that we're exceptional is even in private school choice is in other countries it's considered aid to private schools, aid to the institutions. In this country, we talk about private school choice as assistance to the parents. In fact, actually helping them to redirect their own funding, which they're being taxed, so they are in control. So it's not viewed as aid to institutions, but an aid to parents to put parents in control. And so if we view choice from that regard, which we should, there's really no reason to mandate the same test to all private schools. Other school choice programs, including voucher and tax credit, simply require that private schools administer some norm reference test of their choosing, one of the major tests. And so they still have to provide information to parents, but they can choose a recognized, respected test that reflects their curriculum values. And I want to also touch that. That also raises an issue for homeschoolers, because in many states, homeschooling parents are required to administer a nationally normed referenced standardized test to ensure that, to measure the quality. And what's happening now, even these nationally normed referenced tests, the major publishers have announced they're aligning them to Common Core. They're revising the tests to align them to Common Core. And so it's a real threat, because if you're going to be measured by the same metric, there's going to be a lot of pressure, even on homeschoolers, to demonstrate success on these Common Core aligned tests. Now, the publishers are viewing this from an economic, financial standpoint. If they see 40-something states going in this direction, you know, they're trying to sell to a large market, but it's vital that those of us who support homeschooling as well as private school choice push states to include among the approved tests respected tests that don't align with Common Core. Homeschoolers should always have a choice of tests that are not aligned to Common Core if there's even a requirement to administer a test. So I want to make sure we have time for questions, and also we have some great other presentations.
Hi, my name's Heather Crossin, and I'm a parent from Indiana. My background a little bit is that I was a congressional staffer for Dan Burton in Washington, D.C., and then back in the district in the early and mid-90s. And some of you may remember that was the last time there was an attempt at a federal power grab for education. And there was quite a bit of pushback in state houses in Indiana and all around the country. Hundreds of people pushed back against that attempt at a federal takeover, and were somewhat successful. But you know, after that battle, I got married, had children of my own. I have 4 children. I was pretty much minding my own business, had stopped following it quite as closely during the Bush years until the fall of 2011. And that was when my children came home from their Catholic parochial school with what is now being called fuzzy math. And I'm not sure if some of you are aware of the term, but Michelle Malkin's written about it. And it's basically a remake of the new math that was popular in the 70s and a complete disaster. But to give you just a short explanation, what the parents saw was a shockingly small amount of arithmetic and practice of basic math skills. And students are instructed to approach problems in odd ways unfamiliar to parents. Oftentimes, you know, around the barn, very laborious and clumsy. And then thirdly, the other thing we noticed was that there was a great deal of time, an inordinate amount of time, explaining your answers, how you came up with certain answers, and they wanted very scripted responses from the students. And I've been asked to show just one example of what fuzzy math looks like. This was the first math worksheet that came home and caught my attention. My 3rd grader came to me and said, I can't remember what I'm supposed to do. Now, I could have given her the answers, obviously, but I didn't think that was the right thing to do, and I tried to explain to her the method being employed here. So I said, well, you take the second number, and you're supposed to say 30 plus something equals, or 34 equals 30 plus something. And then you take the first number, 53 plus something equals 83, and then you take 83 plus something equals 87. So that's how you know the answer to 53 plus 34. I was at a complete loss as to how to explain the process they wanted her to use. And I actually thought, oh my gosh, this is that fuzzy math I've heard about that's popular in California. You know, I later learned, you know, some of the approaches they want, which is, you know, to add 312 plus 216, you're supposed to break 312 apart, and it's 300 plus 10 plus 2. 216 is 200 plus 10 plus 6, and the children are instructed to begin in the hundreds column. Add 300 and 200 first, set that aside, then add the tens, then add the ones, and then go back and add it all together. So these were very confusing to parents. We weren't familiar with them, and again, we were like, where's the math? Where's the real math? And the other point is regarding the scripted answers of explanations. To give an example of that, my daughter was asked, Bridge A is 407 feet long and Bridge B is 212 feet long. Which bridge is longer? How do you know? My daughter wrote, Bridge A is longer. I got my answer by just comparing 407 to or for whatever, 407 to 212, and seeing that 407 is greater than 212. Now, to me, I thought for a third grader that was a pretty good answer. Greater than seems like a mathematical term. Wrong. She got the answer mostly wrong. She got 1 point out of 3. She was supposed to write, I compared the add-ins in the hundreds column and saw that 4 was greater than 2. Then I compared the add-ins in the tens column, and so on. So parents became frustrated and complained, and the principal quickly brought in the publisher of the new textbook we had purchased. And we were given these nice samples of Pearson's Envision Math, and we were told how lucky we were to have one of the very first Common Core aligned textbooks in the country. And when the room full of parents were continuing to say they still didn't feel so lucky and they weren't buying what was being sold to them, the statement was made by one of our administrators, look, I know parents don't like this kind of math because none of us were taught math this way, but we have to teach it this way because this is how it's going to be on the new Park assessment. And that is the federally funded test that's in place to replace our state test. And, as somebody who had followed this issue for close to 10 years, I was absolutely shocked that that was the first I had heard of it. So I started calling around. I called, one of the first people I called was a reporter who had followed it extensively, who had, after 22 years in journalism, had retired to become a teacher at a private middle school. And I thought, well, she'll bring me up to speed and tell me what's happened here. I've missed something. And I called her, and she said, I have absolutely no idea. Last I heard, Indiana had pretty good standards. And I researched it, and turns out Indiana did have pretty good standards. We actually had one of the top 3 set of standards in the nation. Then I contacted my state senator, who sits on the Senate Education Committee. He knew nothing about it. I contacted pro-family groups that had followed it closely in the 90s. They knew nothing about it. Pretty much nobody knew anything about it. And that was because it was passed in the dark of night with no publicity, certainly none before, a very small article possibly when they did in fact pass it in 2010. And mind you, this was a whole year later after our unelected state board adopted it, and people still really knew nothing about it. So my friend and I began to research, and we found some of the research that the Heritage Foundation, the Pioneer Institute, and others had done. And we took this research to our state senator, who was good enough to look at what we had to give him and listen, and he decided to introduce legislation. This was about a year ago, the winter, January 2012. And we were so excited, and one of the first calls I made was to Lindsey Burke. I thought, oh, we'll be so grateful if we could just get some testimony, so maybe a letter we can read into the microphone. But instead, we not only got that, we got a lot more. Lindsey immediately put us in touch with a network of people that are fighting this around the country. Chief and foremost would be Emmett McGroarty from APP, who's really kind of become the leader for so many of us. He gives so much of his time. Jamie Gass from the Pioneer Institute has come to Indiana to help us. Ted came and testified this year. Again, our first attempt didn't go very far. It was a done deal. Our governor, Mitch Daniels, and our superintendent at the time, Tony Bennett, made sure the bill did not get out of committee. And so when that happened, my friend and I decided not to give up. We could not believe that something this big had happened and no one knew anything about it. So we decided to take it to the Indiana Tea Parties. We knew this issue would resonate surely with them. So we began crisscrossing the state of Indiana and, made some flyers we started passing out. We had no media attention whatsoever. In fact, we were told by our local reporter, look, this isn't news. No one knows what the Common Core is. And I said, well, yeah, if you would report about it, maybe they would. So gradually we picked up other national allies, and we, Americans for Prosperity, Eagle Forum, American Family Association, and others. And all the while, our concerns and our questions went unanswered and dismissed by our state superintendent, Tony Bennett, who is really the darling of the Common Core proponents. And gradually, we continued to talk, and pretty soon we started to realize we also had the support of many classroom teachers, some of whom were Democrats. By the time November rolled around, we had an unknown and significantly underfunded teacher running as a Democrat for this job of state superintendent, and she began voicing her concerns about Common Core. And lo and behold, she won. She didn't just win, she won more votes than anyone running for statewide office in the state of Indiana, which was something. So when January came, again, we introduced legislation. We held a rally. This time, we had 44 independent organizations behind us, all saying they were opposed to the Common Core. We had 500 people stop, take time out of their day to show up to a rally in our state house in the middle of the day, in the middle of the week. We had legislation that's come to be called the Common Core Timeout Bill. This bill calls for a thorough review through the legislature this summer. It requires our state board to again go back and do a public review, which is they did not do the first time, nor did they do a cost analysis, which is shocking to me as a citizen and as a taxpayer. And it basically calls for a slowing down the implementation so we can do what I consider and would have assumed are simply the hallmarks of good governance. For something this serious that's created this much controversy, certainly just slowing it down. We aren't even pulling out. I wish we were, but it's not a complete pullout. Now, I would think that would be a no-brainer. But the reality is the proponents of Common Core absolutely will not allow it to be scrutinized in the light of day, because the emperor has no clothes. So what they did, they spent over $100,000 in TV and radio ads. They had a slew of full-time paid lobbyists. Again, the Chamber of Commerce came out hard. They had advertisements on the radio. They had the chairman of the House Education Committee in their pocket. So once we got the bill through the Senate, 38-11, we were told, roadblock, your bill won't get a hearing. But we forged on. We continued to speak the truth. We continued to write letters to the editor. And I'm proud to announce that as of right now, it looks like against all odds, against all money, because we had none. The only money is the money that my friend and I have put into it out of our own pockets. And again, the only skin in the game that we have is our children. But against all odds, it looks like, and it's being reported in the paper, that today, with bipartisan support, that bill, House Bill 1427, is going to pass the full House and be headed to the governor for his signature. And I'd like to add that in spite of the deep pockets and connections on the other side, because as Ted mentioned, you know, K-12 education is a $500 to $600 billion industry. And what we found is that many of the people that have a financial interest in seeing one big open market for education and a lot of money to be made, you know, they're all in for this. They want it. And they have a lot of resources, and we frankly have none. But what we have, the people who are fighting this, not just in Indiana, but now it's spread to 13 other states, is we have the truth and we have the facts on our side. And thirdly, we have a passion to protect and defend our children's education and really ultimately their future and America's future. That's what it's at stake, and I implore all of you here to get engaged in this fight against the Common Core. If you're interested in getting started, I recommend you contact Emmett McGroarty with American Principles Project, Jim Stergios from Pioneer, and many others. And by all means, please visit the Truth in American Education website at www.truthinamericaneducation.com. It is a forum where many of us are networking around the country to defeat the Common Core. www.truthinamericaneducation.com, and also be sure and read the many wonderful articles Michelle Malkin, who's here today, has written on the Common Core.
My name is Christel Swasey, and I'm a credentialed Utah teacher. I'm not teaching right now, I'm teaching homeschool. I found out about Common Core a little over a year ago when two moms did a presentation in a little town called Heber, Utah. And when I saw that presentation, actually I saw it on YouTube, you can still watch it today, I saw the red flags everywhere, and so I started researching it myself. One of the first things I did was start a blog. And I didn't start it for other people. I started it because I wanted to keep track of everything in my own mind. And there is so much to keep track of. But as I started researching, I started asking questions of my leaders. The first question I asked was of one of our top lawyers in Utah, and I said, what's the amendment process for these new national standards? And she said, well, why would there need to be one? The whole point is to be common. And so I wrote that on my blog because I thought that was an important fact for people to know, that there's no amendment process. A parent, a teacher, even a school board member cannot change what the National Governors Association and the Council of Chief State School Officers has written behind closed doors and has copyrighted, which our federal government then has put a 15% cap on top of that, saying you can't change it more than 15%. So the next thing I did was I wrote a letter to one of the testing consortia, and I asked, how is this 15% meaningful? Because if in Utah we have 15% more geometry, and in Colorado they have 15% more astronomy, whatever, how is this all going to be on the test? And I got a letter back that said, actually, it is not meaningful to have two different sets of standards. You are going to be tested only on the national federal standards. I got that in writing, so I threw that up on my blog. And then the next question I had was, can a parent opt out? Can a child opt out of the tracking system? We know that every state has a state longitudinal database system now that's interoperable with every other state, and we know that the facts are being shared through the EdFacts exchange. There are so many more things that I could say about the data collection issue, but my point here is that I just asked them, can we opt out? Because I don't want my child tracked for any reason, not for the workforce, not for the human capital, nothing. I don't want him in the system. And after a great runaround, they finally answered the simple yes or no question was no. You cannot opt your child out of the tracking system. So I threw that up also on my blog. And one more thing that I threw up there was I asked several times my state school board, can you give me just the smallest shred of evidence that the claims are true, that the academic standards are an improvement, and that they are not, in fact, harming our children's education? You know, some empirical data, some pilot testing, some little shred of evidence. And I have that in writing too, that there is no evidence, but that they trust the people who made this decision. So it's anti-intellectual and it's anti-academic to make policy changes based on no data, no evidence, no pilot testing, just people sitting around deciding, let's do it this way. And I want to bring out that I've taught English for many years, and so I take great offense at David Coleman, who has never been an educator, who was the lead architect on the English language arts standards, and who has no respect for narrative writing or for classic literature. And in fact, he has said you can Google it, look up some of his comments and the way that he swears at teachers speaking about how students don't need to do narrative writing. And that's not important. Market analysis is much more important than narrative writing. He's leading us down the wrong trail. And now that he's president of the College Board and he's aligning the SAT, ACT to the Common Core standards, I really fear for our country if people don't wake up and say, no, this is not acceptable. We will not have the Common Core in our state. So what I want to focus on just in the next few minutes is how can parents, teachers, educators, taxpayers do something? Because you don't have all the knowledge, all the facts. You don't want to do a huge research project and learn everything that the experts know. But I am here to tell you that you can do so much just as a concerned mama bear, papa bear. And because the mama bears and papa bears, that's why we're going to turn it around. Because this is what the quote that Lindsey read, the people who would die for their kids, even if they're shy, they will go talk to their governor and their state school board and their legislators and their media, because this is about the kids, and it is not going to have a positive result. And when we invest so much teacher training and so much tax money and so much time and technology into the system, if we don't stand up now, what will happen 10 years from now is we won't be able to get out. It will be way too entrenched of a system to ever get out. And this is why they're trying to muffle the sound of the screamers and the jumpers and the people who are saying this is not acceptable. But I believe that we are going to defeat this because of that mama bear factor. A few things that we've done in Utah that have been successful. We've had the big red flyer that we've made, and we have just flooded our legislature and as many people as we can have gotten a hold of this. It says, Common Core nationalized education, do you know what you're biting into? And one of the things in here is that it's a picture of Governor Herbert's signature when he, so we showed this, this is the governor, this is our state superintendent and school board that actually signed us up for this. We also give people the Utah Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. Federally, the FERPA has been altered so that it's completely meaningless, and we have no privacy rights anymore under the federal FERPA. In fact, the Department of Education has been sued by the Electronic Privacy Information Center because of this. But locally, many states still have good FERPA policies, and so we give this out to parents, highlight it and show them what their rights are. We have, some people have pins, no Utah Common Core. You wear it around, and the guy in the drive-thru says, "What is that?" So we just try to, we have pencils, www.utahnsagainstcommoncore.com. We have a petition on this website. It's up to about 4,500 signatures, and I think it will grow. And I think petitions are great. Many states have Facebook accounts that are like Stop Common Core in Illinois, Stop Common Core in Florida. Some of them have a little different title, like Parents and Educators for Educational Liberty. But if you look around, there are a lot of grassroots organizations that are growing. We've been on local radio stations as much as possible. Any media we can get, we try to get. We have cottage meetings where just a handful of people in a home where we talk about the facts. We have PowerPoint presentations where we speak to larger groups. And we've done an anonymous survey of teachers also. Utah teachers were able to go to this website, Utahns Against Common Core, and say what are their real feelings about Common Core. Are they being asked to advocate for this on condition of being employed anymore? And what do they feel really as teachers? Because we've noticed that at different grade levels and different topics and subjects, people have a very different feeling about what Common Core is. And so it's very important to get that teacher feedback, and we're really not getting it because teachers are afraid to speak out right now. Basically, we're calling their bluff. And I tell other parents, have all the confidence in the world. Just like, I love that expression, emperor is wearing no clothes. It's so true. There's no academic basis for this. There's no constitutional basis for this. There's no cost analysis. Teachers, generally speaking, hate it, even if they have to be quiet about the fact. There's nothing supporting the rhetoric. And so I tell parents, if nothing else, just ask questions. We give out contact information. This is the state school board. This is the governor's phone number and email information. The media, we ask parents, write letters, as many letters as you can to the newspapers, because we've got to get this out from under the radar. As long as if we get it up there, if it sees the light of day, like Indiana is doing, it can't stand up to scrutiny. It simply can't. The only thing they have against us is that people don't know about it. So if we continue to talk, I really think we're going to turn it around and save the future of our country. Really, that's what this is about.
Thank you, Christel. Great. Well, thanks to you all. That was wonderful and great perspectives on the various aspects of this issue. I'd love to open it up now. We have about 10 minutes or so for Q&A. Let's take that.
From the Common Core, many of the testing companies, the online, to be perfectly honest, some of the online charter, the larger outfits, that see an opportunity to have their model, all around the country with one. Many of the companies, the technology, as Ted mentioned, is very expensive. There's a great deal of money to be made, not only with the technology, because again, the schools have to have a certain higher broadband capability for the data collection that Christel mentioned. And again, all of the industries that are now doing online classes, online, textbooks are now online. There's just a great deal of money being poured into education, and I think a lot of those forces see a better opportunity with one market versus 50 niche markets.
Oh, I was just going to say, in a New York Times interview, Bill Gates said that he put $5 billion into education reform since 2000, and he is behind, he bought Education Week magazine, which a lot of educators read. He paid the PTA, was it $3 million, to advocate for Common Core before they'd even seen the standards, so they couldn't even know if it was good or bad that they were advocating. And he's paid the CCSSO, and basically he's paid for the whole Common Core, except for some help from the federal government.
A lot of the reviews also.
And the reviewers, thank you, yes, definitely. The reviewers, if you look behind the people who are advocating, also in Indiana, right? Wasn't it Students First that were standing up and advocating? Stand for Children. So there's so many groups that they're all, if you look at who funds them, it's almost always Bill Gates. And Bill Gates has partnered with Pearson now, so they're going to have a total monopoly, in my opinion.
I think it's fair to say, Mike Petrilli of Fordham, Gates funded, actually said it, that now the nation's education policy is Gates's education policy. So this has been driven by Bill Gates from the beginning. This is his project. He got the NGA and CCSSO to take it on as a project, and they got the federal government to take it on as a project.
And one of the, right to you, I just want to make one point about this. One of the arguments for Common Core, which people need to be aware of to be able to respond to it, is actually from the technology companies, that setting national curriculum standards and imposing them on everybody just makes sense, because like in technology, you have to have interoperability standards for one computer to be able to send email to another computer and be able to read it. And when you look at this, when you take this apart, it's completely inapplicable to curriculum. Curriculum and instruction are the product of schools. They're the service. They're not something to allow a school to talk to another school. So it completely falls apart. But when you have business people say something like that to other business people who are used to dealing with technology and ensuring interoperability of technology, it kind of sort of makes sense if you don't think about it. And so the argument that these standards are like technology standards is one of the main arguments. And so there's issues of people making money. There's also issues of people just misunderstanding and buying into false arguments. I'm sorry, you.
And getting back with the corporate, GE shareholders had a big conference in New Orleans on Wednesday, and we picketed out there with Stop Common Core because they're, of course, you know, getting grant money, funding, they're promoting it. So is Exxon. You see those commercials. Louisiana, we have John White and Bobby Jindal. Jindal is touted around this country for being, you know, spot on with school choice, and I talked to Lindsey Burke last year during the debate. We cannot break past a certain level of the political works in Louisiana to get even the legislators or senators to even help us with this. I'm begging this panel to come to Louisiana. Our session ends in June, and we're implementing it in 2014. It is falling on deaf ears, but I did have a little breakthrough with a very liberal reporter. Hopefully an article will come out because he finally sees that even his side of the aisle wouldn't want to give away their voice, you know, the parental rights, state sovereignty issues. But we're trying to break through, and that's all I have to plead with this panel is if you can find time. May 16th, I have a coalition forming. That is a day that's already being planned to invite representatives and senators to listen to this. They will not take the Tea Party's word. It's just, they're not.
Thank you for doing all that. And I just note that, look, the folks on this panel are not the only, there are lots of people out there. There's Sandy Stotsky, there's Zeev Werman, there's Bill Evers from the Hoover Institution. There are experts who have written on this widely that we can help plug in and bring to you. We'd be pleased to work with you.
Yes, because I know all those names.
Yep.
I've written Pioneer Institute. I've written your paper, and, you know, read it and downsized it to flyers. Glenn Beck, Restoring Love.
You downsized it that much, right?
It was hard. It was hard because, you know, some people did ask, I need to get down, it's too much reading, but I did. Glenn Beck's Restoring Love. I was out there with 5,000 flyers, anybody that would listen. And I was going to give up a couple of months ago, but
There's good reason not to.
And I'll just say, Mary, I think you make a really important point. There are two sort of big ed reform pushes that are happening right now.
Right.
You've got this wonderful, massive proliferation of school choice
Right.
that we're seeing state after state implement, right? The Wall Street Journal calls 2011 the year of school choice. We've seen so much of it. So you've got this great, robust push for choice and competition, and at the same time, you have this competing push for standardization and uniformity.
Right.
And I have zero confidence that the standardization will work to improve outcomes, and every confidence that choice and competition will. And so that's what we need to be applauding Governor Jindal for, is the push for choice and competition, and pushing back when we see some of these governors and state superintendents sort of falling under this standardization push.
Louisiana, I'm sorry, I just want to mention, Louisiana is one of the states that requires the voucher receiving schools to administer the state test, the curriculum-based test, and will presumably require a Common Core and impose that on private schools. So the threat of Common Core to the autonomy of private schools is real, and it's something that's very present in Louisiana as well as others.
We did have a little victory, we call it small, as we did descend on the Bessie board. They had an emergency meeting last Wednesday, and we just, with parents, taxpayers, and of course Tea Parties, and he did suspend the data sharing with InBloom to shine the light on it. He didn't just wipe it out, but we did stall it. So there's still that level we can't break through, though.
Texas officially rejected the Common Core, but we have discovered C-scope. Are you all familiar with C-scope? Yes, ma'am. Who is?
We heard about it being Louisiana next to Texas. You know, I used to brag about two
Pretty
states
scary
kicked out
stuff.
Common Core at first during the stimulus package was Alaska, Palin, and Rick Perry of Texas.
So,
I've certainly heard about it. I haven't read into it and looked at what the standards, purport to assess. So I can't speak intelligently on it. I don't know if anybody else has
I
looked
think
at it.
the point is that even if a state officially rejects it, you have to keep an eye on the materials that are being used. And I can't say I'm an expert on it, but I have followed the C-scope issue, and it's widely used in your high schools, I believe. And
widely used.
Yeah,
and when
it's
I first
pushing
heard
Common
about it, honestly, I thought that it was, the person telling me about it it just couldn't be true. There's no take-home material.
Yeah.
So Heather would not have known that her child was having this if it had been C-scope. It is all in the classroom. The children are not allowed to take anything home at all. The teachers, we found out in Senate hearing, have been threatened if they talk about it. I mean, it is the most undercover thing that you have ever in your life conceived of, and we've got like 2/3 of our schools are under the C-scope curriculum.
Because of the concerns, I understand now that there's a review planned of C-scope, and there's been some impact, I think, from the concerns. We'll see where it goes.
Unfortunately, about 2/3 of our State Board of Education has put their stamp of approval on C-scope. We have looked at it, and it's okay. Is there any? What about the SAT test? Are they changing the SAT to go along with Common Core?
David Coleman, who was the chief architect of Common Core, moved over to the College Board. He actually brought over one of the key Gates Foundation officials to go over and work with him at the College Board, so you'll see changes there as well.
But I would like to add, that is not a reason to do it. I've heard some people say, well, if the SAT is changing, it's a done deal. It hasn't officially changed, and if enough pushback occurs quickly this year, in the next 12 months, they won't be able to change it, and that has to happen. That's why the time is short, the stakes are high, and we need to get it done now.
My last question is, can the Common Core exist without the No Child Left Behind authority? Does it rely on No Child Left Behind?
It relies in this sense that No Child Left Behind has some provisions in it that are completely unworkable. Namely that 100% of students, special ed students, students who just came off the boat, 100% have to be proficient in every state and every school in the country, according to No Child Left Behind, next school year. And if they don't achieve that, there are all kinds of negative consequences. Now, it's completely unreasonable. It's obviously utopian nonsense. And in order to get a waiver from that provision, the Obama administration's Department of Education is requiring states to sign on to Common Core. And so that is, they're using a waiver which is supposed to be used to provide flexibility to actually impose something that is prohibited under federal law, which is a federally imposed curriculum and standards. They do have a fig leaf that you can, instead of Common Core, you can provide another college readiness curriculum standards, but the only state that's tried to do that was required to change it to make it fully aligned with Common Core, and that's Virginia. And so it's really just a fig leaf. And so that, in that sense, No Child Left Behind was never intended to impose a national curriculum. It has other problems, but it has this one problematic provision that was expected to be changed when it was reauthorized. That was the idea when the people wrote it. They knew it was unrealistic, but it sounded good. They didn't want, politicians didn't want to tell people, we don't want every child to succeed. So they put this in federal law with consequences. And so now that's being used against states that don't want to do Common Core.
Yeah,
I will tell you that.
waivers are good until the CLD is reauthorized or through the 2014-15 school year.
I will leave you.
want to make sure we have just a minute, so if we just take one question here, if that's okay. I don't mean to be rude, but you've had your hand up for a while.
A more sinister approach to this whole national curriculum deal. Freedom Advocates stated a couple years ago that after the implementation of Goals 2000 and the School to Work program, that 60% of ninth graders believe that it's the responsibility of the government to guarantee a job, and that 63.5% believe it's the government's duty to redistribute wealth. And when you add that to the kind of climate change indoctrination that's going on in schools, you know, our schools have become indoctrination camps. And I think this is to further that and implement on a national scale.
Well, I would say, you know, regardless of the content of the standards, we would oppose this push because it is a push for uniformity and centralization. So even if these were apolitical, wonderful standards, we would still oppose any sort of centralization push. One of the reasons it's so nefarious is that right now, if you are in a school that you fear is pushing some sort of curriculum that you don't like, you, to some extent, have a choice to leave that school. In some states, you've got robust school choice, public-funded school choice, private school choice. As we've mentioned, several of the panelists here, if we have this nationalized curriculum put into place, that choice is inherently threatened. And so I do think that's one of the biggest concerns from our perspective is the threat to choice and competition, and that you will have no options if we have one uniform curriculum in place. So fears like that are...
Can I add something to that? There's a lie that's being spread on every website, anywhere you go, that it's state-led. And the reason they're able to get away with that lie is that the Governors Association is one of the main leaders in the Common Core movement. Well, if you think about it, who did you elect to represent you on the national stage? It's whoever you elected, you know? It's the people who are in D.C. It's not our governors. Our governors are supposed to govern inside of our states, not represent us and having a national presence and making national policy. So that's how they get away with that lie, making it look as if state legislatures or people of the states had led it, when really it's a little group that's not even an elected group.
And the reality is that this is really staff-led. And these organizations, NGA, CCSSL, are based in D.C., as are the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, as are Achieve, which is behind Park. So there are these groups that are all based in D.C. A lot of folks move from one of them to another in jobs. It's a very comfortable little friendly circle. And the notion that this is really bubbling up from the states is not serious.
Well, thank you all very much for coming. I'm sorry we're out of time and have to wrap it up, but we appreciate you coming.